Okay, so we are going to talk about sleep in different animals. And so we were already talking in class about sleep in tree frogs and fish and all sorts of things. So we're going to cover in here, we're going to talk about frogs, reptiles, turtles, birds, land mammals, and marine mammals. And so there is a paper that I have you guys read in class, and it's Hobson's study that was done in 1967 looking at sleep in bullfrogs. So there's something that's really interesting here about specifically with bullfrogs. And if I were to ever to ask you what animal do we have some evidence that might not actually sleep, bullfrog would be the answer. So, but there's a lot of problems here. And so we're going to talk about this. So there was a study done in 1967 by Hobson to look at sleep in the bullfrog. And so what they were able to do with this very interesting sort of contraption here is they were able to do EEG, electroencephalography, on a frog. And they found that the forebrain EEG is at maximum voltage during alert active states, and that when the frog is at rest state, we see more minimum voltage. We see that rest and sleep states are not really universally associated with high voltage cortical activity. So we need to define this behaviorally, okay? Just because we're seeing this particular activity doesn't necessarily mean that the rest state is what we can behaviorally define as sleep. When we looked at the bullfrogs specifically in this particular study, they found that they're actually more responsive during periods of inactivity than when they were active, which indicates that it's not true sleep, that even during these rest periods, that the bullfrog isn't engaging in any kind of sleep. So in that study, they actually concluded that bullfrogs do not in fact sleep. And so the interesting thing is, it's a survival tactic to basically rest without any kind of loss of vigilance. The bullfrog can still react in its rest state, even better, I guess, in theory, when it's in this rest state. And therefore, it doesn't meet our behavioral criteria of sleep. It has to be reversible really quickly. We have to see, in some cases, perhaps lower voltage activity. We have to see that it's homeostatically regulated. All these criteria are technically not being met by the bullfrog. But the problem is there are a lot of limitations with this study. And for the researchers to conclude that bullfrogs do not sleep, it's a pretty bold conclusion. For example, one major limitation of the study is the interpretation of some of the respiratory responses after they delivered electrical shocks to the bullfrogs to see if they were responsive. So they could have actually interpreted these respiratory responses not as accurately, which could mean that they could actually be wrong about their conclusion about bullfrogs in general. Also, it's one study and it was done kind of a long time ago. And so the idea is that maybe we need a lot more replication to determine and make the conclusion that bullfrogs do not, in fact, sleep. If I were to ask you on a test, what animal have researchers concluded don't sleep? Bullfrog would be the answer, but there's a lot of problems with this. So I do want to kind of give you that caveat. So let's look at sleep in reptiles. So there's over 8,000 reptilian species. One in particular is Crocodilia, which includes crocodiles and alligators. And they seem to actually show some pretty strong evidence for slow wave sleep, which is really interesting. However, there's some conflicting reports of if they're actually truly experiencing REM or rapid eye movement sleep-like states. And that's because it seems to be that REM is existing in the absence of eye movements, and we also don't see the muscle tone suppression, which is by definition what REM sleep is. So there's a little sort of confusion there in terms of are they experiencing what is defined as REM sleep? And, are scientists really able to distinguish these REM sleep episodes really adequately from waking? Because as we've talked about REM, REM looks a whole lot like awake states when you look at EEG. But the distinction is the lack of muscle tone. And the fact that rapid eye movements are present. So, is this just some kind of version of wake state that's separate from REM? We don't know. But there seems to be some really interesting evidence, at least for slow wave sleep. So let's look at sleep in turtles. So turtles engage in something called behavioral quiescence. And so this is, we had talked about, quiescence being a sort of a quiet period, right? By definition, as we talked about earlier in the very beginning of these slides, that a quiescent period is not necessarily sleep. So it's not, behaviorally defined as sleep, this quiescent period. But we do see that during this period, there's a reduction in responses when stimulated. And we also see an increase in response latency, as in the turtles are taking longer to respond to being stimulated. We also see that their brain activity is going to increase after disruption of the quiescent state. There's no slow waves detected in the forebrain, so that makes us think that they might not be engaging in slow wave sleep. But we also see this sort of general and marked reduction in neuronal activity during this behavioral quiescent state. So, there is evidence of approaching this idea of a sleep-like period, a sleep-like state. But I do believe that the consensus is that turtles do in fact meet this criteria of sleep close enough. Let's talk about birds. Birds are actually really interesting. So we're going to talk about a specific bird. We're going to talk about the white-crowned sparrow. But let's talk about birds in general. So there's over 10,000 species of birds. We do see that birds seem to be able to experience both REM and non-REM sleep, and this is defined by electrographic criteria, by EEG. It looks like that those REM periods are shorter than the mammals that we observe it in, and they're not losing their muscle tone when entering into REM. And of course, we don't want them to lose their muscle tone, because then if they're perching, for example, on one leg, they're going to fall off. And so they're able to, evolutionarily speaking, adapt to experiencing REM without losing the muscle tone. So you might argue, well, is that really REM if you don't meet one of the criteria, which is the loss of muscle tone? But this is an interesting sort of evolutionary solution to REM itself. So we're seeing a lot of these animals breaking rules, right, left and right, which then begs the question, is our behavioral criteria, our definition of sleep, is it something that can go across all species? There's no right answer. I'm just kind of philosophically bringing the question up. Another thing that birds engage in is unihemispheric slow wave sleep, one hemisphere at a time. So why might they engage in this? Well, if you're flying and you're flying for days and days at a time, you still need to sleep. And so if you're flying and both of your hemispheres are engaged in sleep, in slow wave sleep, then you're going to fall out of the sky. So this being able to sleep one hemisphere at a time allows the bird to be able to engage in flight while also sleeping. Now, the white-crowned sparrow is very interesting. The white-crowned sparrow, actually, we see that their sleep is reduced by about 2/3 during migration season. And this occurs in caged birds. So they don't have to be physically migrating in order to see this occur in birds. There doesn't seem to be any kind of reduction in accuracy or performance in tasks. They don't seem to be impacted by this sleep reduction at all, like behaviorally. They also don't experience any kind of sleep rebound. So this reduced sleep doesn't need to be made up. during this migration season. Now, during the sleep reduction period, we also do not see any kind of thermoregulation issues. We're not seeing any kind of temperature changes that we would see in, for example, sleep-deprived rats. We talked about before being on the particular procedure where they're, on a water disc, and they're experiencing fur discoloration and patterns of fur loss, changes in body temperature and body weight. We're not seeing that in birds. So it's like their bodies have adapted to this 2/3 of reduction in sleep during the migration season, and they're actually not impaired in any way during this reduction of sleep. And so we're seeing this in both caged animals, meaning that it must be sort of an evolutionary mechanism that they're engaging in, even if they're not physically migrating. Now, I will say a caveat, and this is something that is really specific to both mammals and all of the species that we're studying, and that is it's really difficult to study animals in settings where they might be caged, or being able to observe them in the wild. If we're looking at some animals that are in cages or in facilities, it's not going to look like regular sleep, because there's a lot of different environmental changes that happen, and we're going to go into these specifically in land mammals. But it's really difficult to capture sleep. So if we say, oh, that doesn't look like our traditional definition of sleep, it could be simply that it's our observation techniques that's the problem, or the fact that we're observing them outside of their natural habitats. So when it comes to land mammals, there's over 4,000 mammalian species, and there's been a lot of study of domesticated species. For example, rats, mice, cats, dogs, monkeys. They all seem to meet our conventional definition of sleep. Homeostatically regulated. There's sleep rebound, of course, involved with that if they're being deprived of sleep. They're hitting all of the three major criteria. Now, the problem that we have is that we're not studying animals in their naturalistic conditions. And so we're making these observations, for example, in zoos. So like if we're looking at a giraffe and an elephant, large herbivores, in a zoo study, those animals have constant food. They have no predator threats. They're not migrating. They're not given the space that they might have miles and miles of range. Their diet might be slightly different. The temperature, the climate might be very different. There are a lot of differences that we can't account for that may mean that all of the stuff that we're studying in zoo studies and animals that are in different environments may not actually be the same as an animal that's in its naturalistic condition. We see that properties of sleep, of course, vary substantially across species. To make things even more complicated, animals seem to sleep in different ways, even when we're able to study them in and outside of labs. So marine animals are ones that have some really interesting sleep patterns that are very different from land mammals. So for example, we have more than 100 marine mammal species. Otariidae is a species of marine mammals that includes things like sea lions and fur seals. Now, the interesting thing about Otariidae is that they are both on land and in water. And so we actually see a difference of we actually see different in sleep patterns based off of when they're on land versus in the water. So Otariidae I'm going to talk specifically about, and then we're going to talk about cetaceans, which would include bottlenose dolphins and beluga whales. So let's look at like the fur seals and the sea lions. So on land versus in water, on land we see what we would typically see in a land mammal. The EEG shows us that the brain waves are bilaterally synchronized. We're not getting one hemisphere at a time of sleep. They're synchronized. If they're in REM, they're in REM. They cycle through REM and non-REM sleep, just as if it were a typical land mammal and only stayed on land. Now, when they get in the water, that's where we're starting to see some really interesting things happen. So when it comes to sleep patterns in the water, the Otariidae are showing the asymmetrical patterns of behavior. Okay, so we're seeing one side of the body. Remember that we have contralateral control of most things with our hemispheres. So if the right hemisphere, okay, is going to control the left side of the body, if the right hemisphere is in a particular stage of sleep, for example, in REM. Okay, so if the right hemisphere is in REM, you're going to see the left side of the body affected. So that means that the right flipper, which is controlled by the left brain, which is currently not in a stage of sleep, would actually be active. So if we have slow wave sleep in the left hemisphere, okay, then the right side of the body, the flipper, will be active. If we have slow wave sleep in one hemisphere, that contralateral eye is closed. So if we have slow wave sleep in the left hemisphere, the right eye is going to be closed. If we have slow wave sleep in the right hemisphere, the left eye is going to be closed. And the idea is the left side of the body in that case is in slow wave sleep. So another thing that we see is that these marine mammals have really reduced REM sleep because remember, REM is involved in this sort of muscle activity is going to be severely reduced, and that's not super conducive to being underwater. When the animals are back on land, okay, now we're going to see REM on as if it were a land mammal, but there's no rebound. There's very little to no rebound. The animal's not necessarily catching back up in REM sleep. They've sort of adapted to not getting as much REM or not getting any REM in the water, and then on land having its regular REM cycle. So there's no sort of need to make that up. So let's talk about sleep in cetaceans. So a cetacean would include a bottlenose dolphin, a beluga whale. Just like the other marine mammals we've been talking about, they're unihemispheric sleep, slow wave sleep, so they're only sleeping one hemisphere at a time. They don't show this bilateral high voltage waves. These are animals that stay in the water. So they're not demonstrating this bilateral activity. During this unihemispheric slow wave sleep, they might float, but they're usually swimming in some way. We don't necessarily see sort of any asymmetry in the motor activity, but we do see sometimes counterclockwise direction. So they're circling kind of in the same way. And there's a really interesting study that I have you guys read about, specifically about dolphins in different hemispheres of the world. And so what's interesting is that, some dolphins actually swim in different rotations based on where they're at. And that's a really interesting study to read about, specifically about dolphins. Now, when we look specifically about these cetaceans, what we find is some conflicting evidence. And that is do they need to make up rebound sleep after they're being sleep deprived? And it turns out that there's not a lot of consensus on that. So it's probably due to the fact that there's just not enough study on cetaceans to know for sure if this is the case. So we might not be capturing. It's one of those things where, you might be stressing the animal out when they're sleeping anyway, so their quote unquote normal sleep might already be stressed. Another really interesting thing about newborn dolphins and killer whales is that they are continuously active for about 4 to 6 weeks after birth. This goes against our notion that we need sleep to survive. If they're continuously active for 4 to 6 weeks straight, they don't need sleep at any point during 4 to 6 weeks. That kind of changes what we know about sleep and survival. So the question is it truly not, are these newborn dolphins and newborn killer whales truly not experiencing the need for sleep during this time? Or is something else going on? So we see, and we'll talk about this later, in newborn human babies, a different pattern of sleep than a child or an adult. Like, it's a different kind of sleep. They're not experiencing non-REM and REM sleep the typical way that we see in adult humans. It's almost like these quiescent periods. So the question is what's going on here? Is this a different kind of sleep that they're experiencing that we just don't know how to measure, or do they not actually sleep at all? We also see that smaller cetaceans are continuously active throughout their life. They never float, they never sink to the bottom and remain still enough for us to determine if they're engaging in true sleep. So more study needs to be done here. So this is an example of a unihemispheric sleep where a dolphin is going through different stages of sleep. Here you can see that, here's one hemisphere engaging in a more in these particular brain waves, and then here the switch occurs right here, and we see in this case perhaps slow wave sleep here and wake here. And so what this is doing, slow wave sleep here, is shifting, right? So that the dolphin can remain at least one hemisphere constantly awake. And here's another really, really fun way to look at it at the same time. So here we have wake in the right hemisphere, wake in the left hemisphere. Now you start to see the right hemisphere to enter the sleep stage. Left hemisphere is still awake. Now the right hemisphere has then engaged in slow wave sleep. The left hemisphere is still awake, and then now the shift occurs. So now the left hemisphere is going to sleep and the right hemisphere is switched to being awake. So this is just allowing that dolphin to remain alert in the water at all times. At least one hemisphere is alert at all times. So let's look at some final conclusions here. So just like Aristotle stated, and when we talked about the very beginning, sleep appears to be present in just about every animal species, some kind of version of sleep. But it begs the question, do we need to evaluate our definition? A lot of the biological mechanisms are very similar across species, and even, something as meaning is different as a jellyfish, right? Having some really similar mechanisms like melatonin and antihistamines as humans. It's very interesting, comparisons across species, really similar mechanisms. So the question is do we need to change our definition of sleep when studying these different species of organisms to be able to make conclusions about if an animal sleeps and what that looks like? We really have to be really cautious about making conclusions about sleep in different species because we may not have an exhaustive study of the species. If we don't have multiple studies looking at the same kind of species in the same area, then it really isn't safe to conclude if that animal does or does not sleep. And one in particular I'm thinking of is that bullfrog study. Can we make that determination with one study conducted in 1967 when that study had a lot of very obvious flaws? Ultimately, more research is needed. It always comes down to more research is needed in different capacities to look at sleep in vertebrates and try to determine what does sleep look like across the board, and is this something that every animal does, and does it do so similarly? So if you have any questions, you can contact me and know that this particular rest of the material is self-study, and I'm happy to go over this next time we're in class.